I caught up with the Institute's patron, Nobel Prize-winning scientist and the Australian of the Year, Professor Peter Doherty, to talk about the virus that's gripping the globe. So, Professor, initially people were comparing this and saying, well, if it's another version of the flu, why are we so concerned about this? Can you answer that? What is the difference between the coronavirus and other strains of virus?
Yes, well, the influenza viruses that we're used to are the seasonal ones or the pandemic ones. The last pandemic one, the 2009 swine flu pandemic, as we called it, which jumped across into us from pigs, was milder than everyone had expected. And part of the reason for that is that people who are alive in 1977 had been infected with a somewhat similar virus, which seemed to give them immunity. So what's that tells us? And also with all influenza, in fact, there's some background immunity. There's even with a completely new strain. But what we have with COVID-19 is what we call a virgin soil outbreak. That is, we've never seen this virus or anything quite like it before. So there's absolutely no immunity.
Is the vaccine the only way out of this, Professor? Is there another way for us to get to a cure?
The way out of it is through what we call herd immunity, and you could reach that in one of two ways. I mean, you could get everyone infected, and those that survive will be immune. And there's a lot of discussion around that. And to some extent, that's what's happening now in the United States. But if we do that, a lot of people will die because the hospital system will be overwhelmed and we'll lose a lot of doctors and nurses as well. If we could boost the herd immunity with a vaccine, that would mean we'd be reasonably protected.
Professor, rapid antibody testing, something that you've been an advocate of. Can you explain that to us?
What happens when you get infected with the virus, you make an immune response and you make antibodies. And it's those antibodies that are essentially the footprint of infection. They're floating around in the blood. They're basically what we stimulate with vaccination, and that's the protective component. So we need a broad antibody test that can be applied to large numbers of people in the community very easily. And those tests are currently under development, and we're actually looking at some of them right now in our institute, as others are. And once someone's antibody positive, we think they should be safe and they're not going to transmit or they're not going to be infected. So that would be important information. It would also give us a lot of illumination on the issue of actual death rates, because it would tell us how much background infection there is.
Are you convinced that once someone has got it, they're not going to get it a second time?
I'd be pretty certain, but we don't have robust evidence on that. I'd be very surprised.
Professor, we're hearing out of the Doherty Institute as well around maybe repurposing HIV drugs, malaria drugs, even a head lice drug I read about as a potential treatment. Have you got any news or thoughts on that?
Yes, no, we don't know of anything at the moment that's really effective. There's a number of drugs in trial here and elsewhere, and the malaria drug and the anti-HIV drug, I don't know whether they're yet in trial, but there's a trial all set up and it's ready to go. I'm not particularly confident that any of the drugs that are currently being talked about are going to be that useful, but maybe I'd be happy to be wrong, of course. I mean, that would be great. But at this stage, it's too early.
I'm going to ask you the question that I think is unanswerable, but everyone wants to know. When do restrictions ease in your mind? When do we go back to some sort of life as normal? Is there any sort of time frame you've got in your mind?
We'll just have to see what happens over the next few weeks. And my perception is a bit, though, that if we don't have evidence of community spread over the next few weeks and everyone will get a bit more relaxed about it, and then people will mix around more. And if there is some virus out there, it'll tick up again. And so you'd sort of get another issue coming along. And what would you do? Would you try and reimpose all these restrictions, or what would you do? So it's at the policy level, and they're listening to the epidemiologists and the public health people. And as yet, we don't know enough to predict an end to it. The only certain end to it would be a vaccine. And I don't see, at the very best scenario, a vaccine before early next year at the earliest. And that's much earlier than most people would predict.